Today we're fortunate to have Dr. Charles King, a professor of international affairs and government at Georgetown University, who's coming to talk to us about war and peace in the Caucasus, a pretty timely subject given everything that's been happening in the last few months and years. We're very fortunate to have Dr. King. He is a well-renowned academic, and he has published 5 books. He's a contributor. He's been featured on CNN and NPR, National Public Radio, even MTV, believe it or not. And his most recent book, Odessa, Genius and Light in a City of Dreams, is up here. And we have some copies to give out after Dr. King's talk. So I would like you all to join me in welcoming Dr. King to Villanova University.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, folks. Thanks for coming out today. Thanks also to Professor Hardnett, Professor Schrad for inviting me up. This is my first time I've had a chance to be at Villanova, and so I'm delighted to be here. They wanted me to talk about the Caucasus, which is a subject that I've spent a fair amount of time working on, thinking about, a part of the world that I've spent a fair amount of time visiting over the last decade or so. Both the North Caucasus, which is part of the Russian Federation, and the South Caucasus, don't worry, I'll show you a map in a few moments, which consists of 3 independent countries. I hope you don't mind the vocabulary terms up here to start, because it is a place where you may well be the first person on your block to have heard of some of these, the places I'm going to talk about today. So if you can go back and talk to your roommate or your sort of RA about what's going on in Kabardino-Balkaria, I think they will be very, very impressed. Just to go through a few of these terms, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan are 3 independent countries, members of the United Nations, existing south of the main mountain chain called the Caucasus, in that vast area that we now call Eurasia, we used to call the Soviet Union. There are also, however, a series of other places in this region called the Caucasus that may or may not be countries. And I say may or may not be countries. This is sort of the first point I would like to make today. May or may not be countries, because what counts as a nation state, what counts as an independent political entity, who gets sovereignty, who doesn't get sovereignty, who is independent from whomever else, are questions that 20 years after the demise of the Soviet Union are still questions that are imperfectly resolved in this part of the world. Where ought borders to lie? Who ought to be independent? And we saw most recently, most spectacularly, an example of that in the summer of 2008, when 2 of the countries, just at the time that the Beijing Olympics were having their opening ceremonies, half a world away, 2 of the countries of the Caucasus, Russia, or the Russian Federation, and the country of Georgia, came to blows over precisely this issue of borders, sparking something that we now call the Weekend War or the 5-Day War. It was a war that lasted precisely 5 days between Russia and a tiny independent country of Georgia over a stretch of territory that the Georgians claimed was a part of their country, and the inhabitants of that stretch of territory claimed was not part of a country called Georgia. It was a little strip of territory called South Ossetia, located just on the southern foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. The things that I have here in the middle are other examples of, in the Caucasus region, places that may or may not be countries, kind of depending on your perspective. South Ossetia and Abkhazia, according to the international community, are still a part of the independent country of Georgia, even though they haven't been de facto a part of Georgia for going on 20 years now. 18 years in one case, 15 years in another. Nagorno-Karabakh is a little strip of territory that the international community believes is a part of Azerbaijan, but the people who live in Nagorno-Karabakh don't believe it is. That really for almost 20 years, Nagorno-Karabakh has existed as an independent, de facto independent country, even though, of course, it's not recognized by anybody as such. And then, of course, there's probably the most famous example of this in the region Chechnya, a place that I'm sure you've heard of, that fought 2 wars with the country that the international community recognizes it being a part of, that is the Russian Federation. One war in the early 1990s, another in the late 1990s, early 2000s. In fact, it just came formally to an end in 2009. Chechnya is still recognized as a part of the Russian Federation, even though what President Medvedev says or what Prime Minister Putin says really doesn't carry much weight on the ground in Chechnya. So you have a whole variety of territories that still haven't decided these basic questions of statehood. Where ought borders to lie, and who ought to be in control of the territory that lies within those borders. And here I've given you a few kind of vocabulary terms. I'm told there is not going to be an exam on this at the end. A few kind of vocabulary terms for a whole series of places that exist as republics of the Russian Federation. So they're parts of, provinces of, if you like, the Russian Federation, part of Russia, north of the Caucasus Mountains, places like Chechnya, actually. Chechnya is one of them. Dagestan, Kabardino-Balkaria, North Ossetia, Ingushetia, Karachay-Cherkessia, and Adygea. If you've never heard of any of these places, don't be alarmed. There's no reason you should have. If you feel you don't need to pay attention to these places at the end of this lecture, then I'll be rather disappointed. Because I think we should be paying attention to what's happening in all of these places. I'm going to show you a map and come on to these in a few moments, in particular in this place, Kabardino-Balkaria. Because if there is a particularly dangerous part of Russia's Caucasus now, I think it's no longer Chechnya, where both the fighting and the Islamist insurgent movement has died down over the last 3 years. The place that I think is now close to the most dangerous part of Russia's North Caucasus, indeed, perhaps the most dangerous part of Russia now is Kabardino-Balkaria. Might be a tie with Ingushetia, but it's a place that I think we ought to pay a lot more attention to. If we have an image of what the Caucasus is like as a place, though, it's an image that's probably informed by news reporting on the region. If you were paying attention to Russia in 2004, no reason you should have been, but if you were, these images may be rather familiar to you. On the 1st of September 2004, a day that in Russia is called the Dien Znania, or the Day of Knowledge. It's traditionally the first day of the new school year in Russia, where the boys are dressed up in their finest little suits and the girls are dressed up in their frilly dresses and the sort of frilly things that go in the hair. You've all seen young Russian girls dressed up in this fashion. You bring flowers to your teacher, and it's a kind of day of celebration to kick off the school year. In a small town in one of the republics of the Russian North Caucasus called Beslan, located in the North Caucasus Republic of North Ossetia, on the list I showed you just a moment ago. In school number 1 in this small town, a group of insurgents linked to a warlord from Chechnya, just a couple of republics over, stormed the school on the first day of classes, took the entire school hostage. It was an elementary school. Students and teachers, herded them into the gymnasium, and then wired the gymnasium with explosives, including explosives that were tied to pressure triggers, which is a favorite sort of technique of these guys, where you an insurgent places his foot on a pressure trigger, and if he releases his foot from the pressure trigger, then the explosive goes off. It's a really ingenious device. The Russian Special Forces, once this became known, sort of what was going on in this rather remote town, Russian Special Forces and local police surround the school, and the decision is made eventually to storm the school using shot grenades, AK-47s, and so on. The result was really, really horrific. Over 300 children died in the. This is a photo that I took from the gymnasium as it looks today. when a massive fireball erupted in the gym, roof collapsed, and then there was this firefight that lasted for a couple of hours as the special forces engaged in kind of sweeping up operations throughout the gym. This has become a kind of makeshift memorial to the teachers and students who were killed in this attack, which is still the deadliest terrorist incident in modern Russian history. In fact, depending on how you define terrorism, you might say the deadliest terrorist incident in Russian history, full stop. Far deadlier than the attacks, the attack at Domodedovo Airport just a few months ago, the suicide bomber in Moscow. Deadlier than last year's suicide bombings on the Moscow metro. This is on the order of 300 people, and most of them children under the age of 12 who were killed. And if you go there today, you can see in this makeshift memorial the kids' school pictures lining the walls. It's a really very, very moving tribute to the victims. And if you walk through the hallways of the school, they've left things pretty much as they were after the fighting stopped. You can see here sort of a teacher's placard sort of showing verb endings and conjugation of verbs in Russian. You can see the students' homework sort of scattered throughout the school. It has become a very moving tribute to this incident. That was a really horrific shock, as you can imagine, not only to the world, but also to the Russian people and to the Russian Federation itself. After all, this was not a foreign attack on Russian soil. This was an attack on Russian soil by people who were themselves citizens of the Russian Federation, attacking and killing other citizens of the Russian Federation for reasons having to do with the war in Chechnya, with the rise of radical Islam in Chechnya and other parts of the North Caucasus, and opposition to the central Russian state on the part of insurgent groups throughout this southern territory of Russia. It also, however, fit particularly with long-term images that I think we have about the Caucasus as a place, that I'm going to talk a bit more about today, and long-term images that Russians themselves have about the Caucasus as a portion of this vast Russian heartland. And those images have to do with things exactly like that were experienced in September of 2004 in North Ossetia. Violence, terrorism, ethnic extremism, nationalism, radical Islam, and the list goes on and on. But that cluster of things that are meant to define what the Caucasus is. What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about some of those images of the Caucasus, where they come from, how accurate or inaccurate they might actually be, images having to do with the barbarous or warlike or difficult nature of politics, society, culture in this part of Russia and beyond. And then come on to talk a little bit about some of the contemporary politics of the region, both in Russia's Caucasus and south of the border in the independent countries of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, to try to give you perhaps maybe a more nuanced picture of politics and society in this part of the world than we normally have. And so I'll do that for about 40 minutes or so, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions and discussion after. If I ever say anything that you violently disagree with, well, don't be violent, but seriously disagree with, please just raise your hand or stop me, or if I'm saying something you don't quite get, please do stop me, and I'll take some time to try to explain what I mean then. Well, let me show you some maps, just to give you a sense of the sort of area that we're talking about. And these are in Russian, and I apologize for that, but you don't actually need to read the labels to get the point I'm going to make with these maps. At some point, any talk on the Caucasus begins with a Jackson Pollock map of the Caucasus. That is, the one that looks like you just sort of slung paint of various colors at it, right? And what you're always supposed to take away from maps of the Caucasus, like this, you often see maps of the Balkans, of Bosnia and Serbia, and sort of that look kind of similar. And what the speaker often wants you to say is, aha, no wonder this place is a mess, right? These people can't even color in the lines, right? I mean, this is a mix, an ethnically, linguistically, religiously mixed part of the world. And therefore, obviously, it has loads of problems. Right? Well, I'd like you not to take that away from this map. I would like you to take away the first bit, that it is an ethnically, linguistically, culturally mixed part of the world, and I'll talk about what some of these colors mean in just a moment. But that there is no one-to-one correspondence between the mere fact of a multi-ethnic, multicultural society and violence. There is no connection, no necessary connection between those things. Some of the most peaceful parts of the world are also the most multi-ethnic parts of the world. Some of those violent parts of the world are those in which you have 2 or 3 major ethnic groups, not literally hundreds, like you have here in the Caucasus. So there's no necessary connection between those two things. But it is important to understand the really diverse nature of society, history, and culture in this part of the world. So here in the blue, a group of people called the Georgians in the modern country, independent country of Georgia. By the way, the main chain of the Caucasus Mountains, I'll show you a geographic map in just a moment, but the main chain of the mountains kind of run from northwest to southeast, just in sort of this area. Where you see all of this white are sort of upland, high altitude regions of the Caucasus where very few people actually live. So south of the main chain of the mountains, the independent country of Georgia, Georgians speaking a language related only to Georgian and other Georgian sublanguages, related really to nothing else around it. Well, it's not exactly true. Georgian is related to Svan, which is related to Laz, which is related to Mingrelian, but that doesn't tell you very, very, very much. They're all part of a general Kartvelian, as it's called, language family. Here in the orange, country of Armenia and Armenians as an ethnic group, speaking a language distantly related, or speaking an Indo-European language, so distantly related to other Indo-European languages, like the Georgians, traditionally Christian. In the Georgian case, Orthodox. In the Armenian case, normally called the Armenian Apostolic, or sometimes Gregorian Church. Over here in the yellow, the country of Azerbaijan and the group known as the Azerbaijanis. So again, 3 independent countries here, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. The Azerbaijanis, traditionally Turkic speaking a language not that different actually from the Turkish spoken in the country of Turkey over here. Traditionally Muslim by religion, and within that category, traditionally Shia by religion, and therefore connected religiously to the country of Iran, just here to the south. But as you go to the outlying sort of borders of the country of Azerbaijan, you begin to get all sorts of different multi-ethnic patterns here. And in fact, it's no coincidence that when you look at the border lines of the countries of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, it's precisely in these kind of mixed areas where you have those states not states that I was talking about at the very, very beginning. The area of Nagorno-Karabakh here, fought over since the late 1980s by Armenia and Azerbaijan, with now an in the main ethnic Armenian population plonked down inside what is still recognized as Azerbaijan. The territory of South Ossetia, the cause of that war in 2008 between Russia and Georgia, with its significant population of so-called Ossetians, ethnically unrelated to Georgians, living here in the foothills leading up to the Caucasus Mountains. And this area in the northwest of Georgia called Abkhazia, again another one of those states not states, populated by ethnic Abkhaz, again unrelated to Georgians but related to a group on the other side of the mountain. I know this can be rather confusing, so that if at any point you have any questions about this, please do ask. Here in the north of the main chain, things get even more complicated, right? As if that wasn't complicated enough. Everything to the north of this dark line you see here is Russia. But it's not the Russia of Peter the Great in the Hermitage Museum. It's not the Russia of Tolstoy, although Tolstoy was in this part of the world at one point, or the Russia of Dostoevsky, but it is Russia. It is both culturally and to a degree linguistically and certainly politically now Russia. But it's a kind of Russia that we're often not that familiar with in the West, a Russia of real cultural diversity and critically Muslim Russia. Russia is a country that by the beginning of this, by the middle of this century, looking at some estimates, and Professor Schrod will correct me on this, some estimates say that Russia will have a Muslim plurality population by the middle of the century. I think that's a bit of an overestimate in my view. But Muslims account for a sizable percentage of the Russian population already. We don't even sort of take that on board most of the time. Russians themselves don't often take that on board most of the time. But this, in addition to a couple of other regions of the Russian Federation, is where many of those Muslim populations are traditionally concentrated. A group here in yellow called the Circassians, a group here called the Chechens that you'll be familiar with, a group here called the Ingush, and a group here loosely called the Dagestanis, simply because they happen to live in upland territory called Dagestan, but broken down into a whole number of different ethnic and sub-ethnic categories, the Lezgins and the Avars, and many, many others. This is, I think, both demographically one of the most complex bits of the Russian Federation, and over the last 20 years, it's been one of the most politically complex parts of the Russian Federation. Because again, two wars in Chechnya over what the status of Chechnya and the Chechen nation should be, and as I'll try to illustrate in a few moments, growing problems with an Islamist-fueled insurgency across the northern part of the Caucasus, linked to many of these ethnic populations. Just again to give you a sense of why geography matters here, because the Caucasus is a seriously difficult place to get into, out of, through, and around. It has been historically for invaders from the north or from the south. It was historically for the Russian Empire that spent the better part of half a century conquering the Caucasus uplands in the north. Some of the great figures, some of the great anti-Tsarist figures in Russian history, I'll talk about one in just a few moments, came from the North Caucasus. And here again you can see sort of the main chain of the Caucasus mountains going from really one peninsula to the next, something called the Taman Peninsula just up here in the northwest, something called the Absheron Peninsula jutting out into the Caspian Sea over here. By the way, that's the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea over here. There's Turkey, there's Iran, and then the Caucasus sort of in the middle of the remnants of empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Iranian Empire from days gone by, and of course the old Russian Empire, Soviet Union to the north. You also have just to the west of the center in the main chain of the Caucasus some of the highest mountains in Europe. If you think of the Caucasus as being in Europe, some of the highest mountains are here. In particular this one, you see marked with the triangle, called Mount Elbrus, which is a legendary peak, highest mountain in Europe, significantly higher than the Alps. So we're talking about, very rough terrain. And it's one of those features of the geography of the Caucasus that's made it so difficult for conquerors of one sort or another over the last 2 centuries, and has made it rather difficult even for the Russian Federation in dealing with its own southern border over the last 2 decades. Well, we've talked a bit about ethnicity, we've talked a bit about geography. What about the folks who live there? This is a wonderful image. It's from something called the Prokhodin-Gorsky collection. You can find this and plenty of other photos like it on the Library of Congress website. It's a photo from the very beginning of the 20th century. And we're not used to seeing photos from the beginning of the 20th century of this crispness. And in fact, we're not also used to seeing them in color. But Prokhotin-Gorsky was a rather famous early Russian photographer who went all over the empire, photographing the various peoples and places of the empire. And you can go to the Library of Congress website and have a look at some of these. They're really splendid. This is a couple from Dagestan, so way up in the northeast of the Caucasus region. And I like this photo for a couple of reasons. One, it gives you an image of, I think, when Russians think of the Caucasus, perhaps when even we in the West think of the Caucasus, this is a kind of image of the people that we often have in mind, especially the way the guy is dressed here. He's wearing all of the typical attire of someone from the Caucasus. This long tunic he's wearing is called a Cherkeska. It has a series, these aren't cigar cases, by the way, these are cartridge holders on his chest so that he can pull out a cartridge, put it in his muzzle loading gun, and be ready for battle at a moment's notice. He has a long dagger here called a kinjal, a hiltless dagger. He's wearing just at his side, you can barely see it, a hiltless saber called a shashka. He's wearing a sort of collarless shirt called a beshmet, and then this hat, this sort of fuzzy hat he has on his head called a papaha. So all the way from the western reaches of the Caucasus to the eastern reaches of the Caucasus, from the uplands of the north to Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, traditional national costume looks something like this in all of those, in all of those regions, despite the map that I showed you earlier of this sort of ethnic and cultural diversity. There's a real identity to the Caucasus that all these people, regardless of the language that they speak and the culture they come from, share in common. And dress and dance and music are some of those. The woman, a not untypical sort of attire for her as well, with this rather high-waisted and very, very tight-fitting dress at the top, going sort of flowing with these sort of long flowing sleeves and a long dress. And then, of course, you know, the magnificent scenery of the Caucasus sort of depicted behind them. And keep in mind, again, this is from the first decade of the 20th century. But if you were to see a Caucasus dance troupe today from Chechnya or from Armenia or from Georgia, they might be dressed in a fashion not dissimilar to this. The other thing I like about this is that this Caucasus mountaineer, wearing all of the accoutrements of a man from the Caucasus, is also wearing his Russian imperial medals. That is, yes, he's a Highlander, independent of spirit and so on, but at some point he fought on the Russian imperial side and was awarded decorations for valor that he's sort of very proudly displaying here, which in some ways I think is another theme that we have to understand in the past and the present of this part of the world. It has been a traditional frontier. It's been a borderland between different imperial powers, between different military powers, and the people who have lived there, I think, have historically had a real sense of how you play off one power against another. You know, at what points do you compromise? At what points do you fight? And there's a very finely attuned sense in the region of how you do imperial management, how you manage your patron, how you seek out a patron to protect you against your neighbors or against other imperial rivals. Let me show you a few other historical photographs to give you a sense of, again, some of the diversity of this region, but perhaps the unity and diversity at the same time. These are a group of what I sometimes call Caucasus Midlanders. That is, they don't live way up in the highlands, nor do they live down on the plains. They live kind of in the foothills. In this case, the foothills along the coast of the Black Sea. If any of you follow the sort of details of Caucasus ethnic history, these guys are called Laz, L-A-Z, an ethnic group that inhabits the borderland between what is today Georgia and Turkey, right along the coast of the Black Sea. And they've got, again, a lot of the things that we and Russians have in our heads when we think of people from the Caucasus. You know, they're armed to the teeth, first of all, with their, carbine rifles, their bandoliers of shells. They've got the kinjal, the traditional hiltless dagger. A couple of them are wearing small papacha, sort of fuzzy hats made of lambskin. Others are wearing these sort of turban-like things that you find all along the coast of the Black Sea for men. And then, well, you've got sort of a bottle down here, which may or may not be typical for the region. And then you've got the thing that every good Highlander has to have, which is a bagpipe. Yes, there is a bagpiping tradition in the Caucasus, and it's not just a Scottish thing, but Highlanders in general have found some reason to blow up a sheep's stomach and try to make music out of it. And the laws are really no different. But again, these images end up being very, very important in the way that we think about the Caucasus today, and especially the way that Russians, I think about what the Caucasus is and what the people who are like, people who live there are actually like. Here's another image from the American experience. Two noble savages, we might call it. This is a publicity photo from, can anybody guess, by the way? Anybody guess where's the public? Yeah.
Wild Bill, Wild West.
You were exactly right. It is from a publicity photo from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Well, Wild Bill Hickok had, a similar thing. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Buffalo Bill Cody, one of the great Western entertainers in American history, had, as part of his Wild West show, which was kind of like a traveling rodeo that would go along and go around and do horseback riding and sort of other things you would see in a rodeo, town to town at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, he collected horsemen and trick riders from around the world and had this kind of pageant of horsemen from around the world who would do tricks for the paying public. Of course, the Lakota Sioux, some of the great horsemen of the North American continent, and also people from the Caucasus, known for their horse breeding and horse riding traditions. These guys were actually from the same group, sort of related to the people that you saw in the previous photo, Georgian speakers from the lowland South Caucasus. He called them Cossacks, though, in his show, because the word Cossack probably meant something to Americans at the time, sort of the wild Eurasian frontiersman. If he had used the word Laz, no American ever would have known what that was, but Cossack had a kind of ring to it, to American audience. But you see, once again, he's got the shashka here, he's got his kinjal, he's got his papacha, he's wearing his cherkeska, he's got all of the typical things associated with someone from the region. What I like about this photo is, well, this guy clearly has the better end of the deal because he's got a 6-shooter against just a spear. But this in some ways encapsulates the two great noble savage traditions that Buffalo Bill Cody was trying to sort of portray to an American audience. The noble savage of the American frontier in the person of this kind of imagined Hollywood-style Indian, and then the noble savage of Eurasia, someone from the Caucasus. You can't get more savage, you can't get more warlike, you can't get more noble than that. And he's got him dressed up in exactly the way that we would expect to see him based on some of the photos that I just showed you. This is also, if I can sort of insert a footnote here, this is also something that's true, I think, about Russian history and Balkan history and the history of many parts of Eastern Europe and Eurasia. That is, that your great-great-grandparents, my great-grandparents, actually knew more about this part of the world than we probably know today. Or at least they had more familiarity with this part of the world than we have today. You know, our great-great-grandparents or great-great-great-grandparents could have paid to go to a rodeo in their hometown where trick riders from Georgia were there to perform for them. Right? At the end of the 19th century, if you went to a so-called dime museums before the age of film were places where you would go in and see what we might now call a freak show, but it would be a two-headed calf and some exotic plants and animals and some exotic tribesperson from some country around the world that we didn't know much about. There was still one of these in Baltimore before, not too long ago, only about 10 years ago. It closed down. but you would go into one of these things. They existed in Chicago and New York and Philadelphia and everywhere. And you could talk to people from the Caucasus, or at least people dressed up like people from the Caucasus. They really weren't. But you could go and pay your money, and someone would tell you about what life in the Caucasus, in the savage, remote, exotic part of the world, was actually like. It's fascinating. In fact, if you type in the word Circassian beauty on eBay, as your homework assignment, Circassian, that was one of those ethnic groups in the Caucasus I was talking about a few moments ago. Circassian beauty, you can find dozens of photos of these women because people traded them like kind of trading cards. They were exotic beauties of their day. They were probably Irish girls from the Lower East Side in New York who were dressed up like women from the Caucasus, but nevertheless, you could go in and they would describe to you what this part of the world was like. We've forgotten, in some ways, our connections to this part of the world. Our ancestors knew much more about it, at least in a pop cultural sense, than we do. I mean, in a way, imagine what our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren looking back on our experience of a tiny little place called Bosnia or Kosovo. We'll think, geez, whoever heard, they will say to us, whoever heard of these places and why did you care so much about them in the 1990s or early 2000s? The Caucasus was the same thing for the same, for the same kind of reason. And one of the reasons for that is because in the middle of the 19th century, one of the most famous, and I mean really world famous people in Russian history came from the Caucasus. But he wasn't a czar, he wasn't an emperor or other leader of Russia, he wasn't a great writer or artist, he wasn't a Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, he was a rebel. And it's this guy seated here shown with two of his sons. He was named Shamil. He was sometimes called Imam Shamil. He was Muslim. He had a kind of position of religious leadership. He came from the northeastern Caucasus, in that area of Chechnya and Dagestan that I talked about a few moments earlier. And for about 25 years, in the middle of the 19th century, he was the greatest threat to the Russian Empire, internal threat to the Russian Empire. He led the longest-lived rebellion against the Russian Empire of the day, and he became literally world famous as a kind of what we would now call an insurgent, an Islamist insurgent battling the Russian central government. He began his fight in the 1830s, leading a group of Muslim Highlanders from the North Caucasus, attacking Russian troops, attacking other local elites who were still loyal to the Russian Empire, and became, in the 19th century, the most famous local insurgent ever in the region. He was sort of the equivalent, if we make a comparison to the American experience, a kind of equivalent of Sitting Bull or Cochise or Geronimo. One of these famous insurgents from the American frontier, famous Native American leaders who are seen in American history as being, yes, perhaps on the wrong side of some narrative that we tell about our own westward expansion. They were the enemy, after all, is the way that they're often portrayed, yet they were a kind of noble enemy. They were a noble adversary, an adversary you could respect, because once you beat them, if you end up beating them, then you've really done something. The same thing happened to Shamil, because he surrenders to Russian forces in 1859, and then spends the rest of his life until the early 1870s in a kind of what amounts to internal exile, out of the Caucasus but in another part of Russia, and he becomes a real celebrity. The most famous Caucasus Highlander of his day, known throughout Europe and certainly known across the Russian Empire, because he's trotted out for every opening of a sugar factory, or anytime you need a celebrity, you can call on Shamil and he'll come down and be your local exotica in a way. He'll be your sort of local celebrity. The same thing incidentally happens to Sitting Bull, right? The great adversary of Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. What does Sitting Bull join? after he surrenders. What's that? Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Yes. And then Sitting Bull, the great leader of the Lakota Sioux Nation, plays himself as an Indian in a Wild West show, right? Until he is actually murdered later on. Shamil does the same kind of thing. He doesn't really join a Wild West show, but he does become a local celebrity in other parts of Russia. He dies while he's making the Hajj to the holy places, Mecca and Medina, in 1871. So this is a photo taken shortly before his death. What's fascinating to me about this photo is not just Shamil himself, but the later history of the two people standing beside him. The person on the left side of the screen is named Ghazi Mehmet. That was one of his sons. He had a number of sons and a number of daughters by several wives. Ghazi Mehmet eventually continues the fight against Russia in the highlands. He goes to the Ottoman Empire, and later in the 1870s, in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78, fights on the Ottoman side. The descendants of Ghazi Mehmet, as late as the 1920s, are still fighting against, well, by that stage, against the Bolsheviks for an independent North Caucasus republic. He becomes, in other words, an Ottoman. He then becomes, or his descendants then become Turks in a way, fight continually for the liberation of the Caucasus from Russia. The person on the right is his elder son named Muhammad Shefi. Muhammad Shefi becomes a Russian imperial governor in central Russia and later in Siberia, working for the Russian imperial state. He becomes a Russian bureaucrat, in other words. And his descendants clearly become Russians. His descendants become Turks. His descendants become Russians. From the same guy, the children of the same Caucasus Highland leader produce lines that go in totally opposite directions. But that in many ways is not atypical for this part of the world. If we think back to that Jackson Pollock mixed up color map that I showed you at the very beginning, one conclusion you could take away from what you know about the Caucasus is this place has always been violent. It's violent because it's multi-ethnic, and people feel very, very strongly about their identities and come to blows because of religious or ethnic differences. But if you look at the history of someone like Shamil, you would have to really come to a different conclusion, that all of those colors that I showed you on the map are pretty changeable. They move around. They shift from generation to generation, and there's in fact no necessary correspondence between how people feel about their identity, or at least across generations, and their willingness to take up arms to defend a piece of territory, defend a particular piece of real estate. Well, let's sort of fast forward to the present, and how do some of these things sort of play out in the contemporary Caucasus, both north and south? Some of the themes that I've been trying to bring up to now. This is a photo that I took a few years ago in 2006. Let me explain what it is, because it's a rather complicated photo. It is a rally in the capital city of one of those North Caucasus republics called Kabardino-Balkaria, inside Russia, up in the northwestern bit of the Caucasus. But it's a rally in support of the ethnic secessionists across the mountains in Georgia, the Abkhaz, who are trying to create their own independent state inside Georgia. In fact, they don't want it to be inside Georgia. They want it to be sort of fully independent. This is being held in Kabardino-Balkaria because the majority ethnic group in Kabardino-Balkaria are called the Circassians. Word I used before, Circassian beauties from dime museums in mid-19th century America. And these Circassians, all of these characters, are related ethnically to the Abkhaz on the other side of the mountains. So they're sort of supporting their ethnic cousins, if you like, against the foreign Georgians. So everybody wants independence. Everybody's sort of rallying for independence. And you've got a whole slew of different representatives of different bits of the North Caucasus coming out to show their support. This green flag with the stars and arrows on it is the Circassian national flag. I don't know if there are any Circassian, I don't know if there's much of a Circassian community in Philadelphia, but if you go to Paterson, New Jersey, there's a sizable one there. And if you go to into like a Middle Eastern grocery store in Paterson, you may in fact find real live Circassians working there. So if you ever see this flag anywhere, you can start a conversation with someone about, well, are you Circassian or not? You've got here the flag of the Russian Federation, of course, the Russian national flag. Here you've got this beautiful green and white striped flag of Abkhazia, so that's the national flag of the Abkhaz. Here you've got the political flag of Kabardino-Balkaria, which is different from the Circassian ethnic flag. You've got a banner of the Union of Veterans of the War in Afghanistan. Why not? They're in support of, they're pro whatever is whatever the rally is for as well. Here you've got the flag of South Ossetia, another bit of Georgia that wanted to break away, that, as I mentioned earlier, was the cause of that Russia-Georgia war in 2008. And then here, my favorite bit of this photo, just up here, you've got this flag upside down, which means nothing other than that the guy couldn't remember which way it went, right? Demonstrating once again that it is possible to get your nationalism wrong, right? You can get your nationalism wrong. This guy got it right. And there's some later photos where this guy who's holding the flag is kind of looking up and realizing, oh man, you know, and then he sort of takes it down and puts it back up the right way. All of these issues are still of critical importance in the North Caucasus. Who gets a flag? Whose flag is most respected? What's the relationship between local ethnic groups and the Russian center? Right? How much local autonomy should these groups have? And now critically, after the end of the war in Chechnya, the spread, I think, of a low-level radical Islamist insurgency that seeks to create across the entire North Caucasus a single so-called emirate, a North Caucasus emirate, that would be independent of Russia and ruled according to Islamic law. This is not, you know, a movement that has a huge number of adherents in the region. In fact, this is a rally not in support of Islam, but in support of good old-fashioned nationalism, of its good old-fashioned European variety. Nothing particularly religious about any of the symbolism or the goals of these individuals here. But you now have, growing across the North Caucasus, a contest among all these different kinds of strains: Islam, nationalism, autonomy, sovereignty, relationship to Moscow, and then critically this, as I mentioned, a sort of low-level, rather small group of individuals who are willing to engage in really horrific acts of violence, like the siege of Beslan in 2004. Yes, sir?
Just a question. When you say nationalism, is that equivalent with self-determination or not necessarily?
Well, not necessarily, because nationalism can be many things. I mean, nationalism can be waving a flag and supporting your national football team, your soccer team, right? But for most of what this rally in particular is for is exactly what you indicated: self-determination, meaning secession and create an independent nation state. Yeah. Good question. So all of these themes that I've sort of been talking about historically and how these relate then to our image of the Caucasus and crucially Russia's image of its own Caucasus, all, I think, come into play. But that's also true not just in Russia itself, but on the other side of the mountains, in the South Caucasus, in the independent countries of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And let me use the Georgian case as a kind of illustrative example here. This is the current Georgian president, Mikhail Saakashvili. He was just in Washington last week, made a trip to the United States, gave a series of talks in Washington and elsewhere. He was on Charlie Rose, very, very good, speaks excellent English, graduate of Columbia Law School and of George Washington University in D.C., urbane, European. Well, here you see, you know, this is not a cartoon. He hasn't just been bonked in the head. This is, he's in front of a European Union flag addressing the European Parliament in 2006. Saakashvili came to power as Georgian president at the beginning of 2004. He was elected president of Georgia, following on from something called the Rose Revolution, which some of you may have heard of. The previous Georgian president had attempted to falsify elections. There was a mass public rally in support of free, fair, and honest elections, led by Saakashvili and some of the younger Georgians on the political scene at that stage. The previous president agreed to resign, to have new elections, and Saakashvili was the person who won and came to power and has been president of Georgia ever since. The fact that his coming to power in early 2004 represented a kind of generational change in post-Soviet politics, with young, English-speaking, Western-oriented, Western-educated elites coming to power, meant that what was going on there was of critical interest to the United States. Right? Here was in 2005. George W. Bush made a state visit to Georgia. The Georgians renamed the highway to the airport in his honor. It's probably really the only country in the world where there is a George W. Bush Avenue, but there's one in Georgia. Georgia became, after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the invasion of Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, Georgia became the second largest second largest troop contributor per capita in Iraq, and the third largest troop contributor overall. I mean, think about that for a moment. Georgia is a country of less than 5 million people, depending on how you count. Georgians say more than 5 million. My guess is about 4.9 now. 5 million people. It was the third largest troop contributor in Iraq. Right? United States, UK, Georgia, which tells you either something about Georgia or something about the coalition effort in Iraq. I'm not sure which. But Saakashvili hitched his wagon to the Western star, to America's star in particular, portrayed himself as America's greatest ally in Eurasia. Georgia was critical for overflight rights for U.S. resupply missions to Afghanistan, because you have to have overflight rights to fly across this vast amount of territory, land, and sea to get to that part of the world. Georgia was very happy to allow American planes to fly through Georgian airspace. And the Bush administration became very tight with the Saakashvili administration throughout that period. Oil kind of played into it, not because Georgia is a source of oil, but it's a very important transit point for oil and natural gas coming from the Caspian Sea basin. Saakashvili became a real darling of the West in Washington. At the same time that he was continually, I think, stoking Russia, because Russia had been supporting Abkhazia and South Ossetia in their bids for independence from Georgia. All of this led up to that really horrific war in 2008. Horrific in that it took place during the Olympics, which is meant to be a time of peace, and horrific because it involved what amounted to a kind of American ally at war for only 5 days with the Russian Federation. Very serious international incident. Since then, since the end of the Bush administration and the chastening of Saakashvili after 2008, relations between Georgia and the United States have cooled a little bit, I would say. But this is a classic example, it seems to me, of small states and small nations in the Caucasus seeking external patrons. Shamil, in the middle of the 19th century, wrote letter after letter, which still survive, to the Ottoman Sultan, seeking the Ottoman Sultan's support against the Russian Empire. Saakashvili begged and begged for years and years for Georgia to become a member of NATO. And in fact, there were supporters. John McCain, during the last election, you may recall John McCain and Sarah Palin were supporters of Georgia's early membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, becoming NATO allies of the United States. Georgia is, of course, not a NATO ally now. So this search for patrons, looking for patronage, and those patron-client relationships are things that I think still infest the Caucasus. So just to remind you, both across the south in the independent countries, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and across the north in this whole alphabet soup of territories inside Russia, questions of sovereignty, of war and peace, questions of who gets self-determination and who doesn't, and then how the very complex local politics link up with global politics involving the United States or regional powers like Turkey and Iran, or of course the most important regional power in the region, Russia itself. All of these have important historical roots, and I think they're still applicable today. So I'll stop there. I'll probably talk for too long, but maybe we can open this up to a kind of discussion and conversation back and forth. Complicated part of the world. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just curious, you haven't mentioned anything about other religions. Is there
Yeah.
any Jewish population in this whole area that came from Ukraine down?
Yeah, no, there are Jewish populations. They're tiny. They've been traditionally tiny. Tbilisi in the Russian imperial period had a very active Jewish population. We would call most of the Jews who traditionally lived here Sephardic or a version of Sephardic Jewish, not sort of Jews, if you're more familiar with Western Ukraine or Poland, sort of very different traditions, not Yiddish-speaking populations at all. So Tbilisi, the Georgian capital, had a rather significant Jewish population. Baku and some of the cities to the north had small but significant Jewish populations. There are also in both areas of the North Caucasus and in northern Azerbaijan indigenous Jewish groups that don't fit that sort of into Sephardic or other categories very well. One group called the Mountain Jews, or the Tats, who speak a language that is distantly related to Iranian, but they're religiously Jewish. There is another group that you find along the Black Sea coast, actually much more in Crimea over here than elsewhere, but you do find some of them in the Western Caucasus, called the Karaim. They're sometimes called Karaite Jews, a group of pre-Talmudic Jews who traditionally spoke a Turkic language. Not Yiddish and not Russian, but a Turkic language, who were actually, they played a very interesting role during the Holocaust because the Nazis did not consider them to be racially Jewish in the Nazi sort of scheme of who is a Jew and who isn't a Jew. And so Karaite communities by and large survived that experience throughout Eurasia because they weren't considered target populations, even though religiously they were clearly Jewish. But this is a part of the world where you can get Jews who speak Turkic and are pre-Talmudic. So you get these weird, really fascinating mixtures of different kinds of cultures and societies.
Are they terribly threatened with this fundamental Islamic group?
No, I mean that hasn't been, because there's such tiny populations. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of people in some instances. They're very, very tiny communities. And so that has not been a particular focus. In fact, the anti-Semitic dimensions of radical Islamic ideology in the North Caucasus have not been, to my mind, not terribly pronounced. All of these groups condemn Israel and what happens in Israel, but that's not a really motivating, a highly motivating part of their ideology, I think. Yeah.
You mentioned that Shamil started resistance against Russian Empire in 1835. And this is the time approximately when Georgian Queen Tamara sent delegation to Russia with request to join Russia, the Russian Empire.
Mm-hmm.
So finally, I guess Georgia became part of the Russian Empire in 1842.
Mm-hmm.
Does it mean that Shamil was fighting Russian troops moving towards Georgia to fortify this union?
No, I mean, I think we want to be careful about chronology a little bit, because the first bit of Georgia that becomes officially a part of the Russian Empire becomes a part in 1801, and that's the areas of eastern Georgia, the so-called Kingdom of Kartli Kakheti. It takes until the 1860s for the other bits of Georgia finally to fully join the Russian Empire. That's a sort of a part that even, I think, professional historians of this part of the world sometimes forget, that there wasn't one act in which all of what we call Georgia, joined the Russian Empire. It was sort of bit by bit. Shamil begins his activity in the late 1830s. Is active for a little more than 20 years, so surrenders in 1859. Throughout that time, he's constantly trying to make inroads to upland populations, Muslim upland populations that live in the very north of Georgia. For example, there's a group of ethnic Chechens, or we would call them ethnic Chechens, who live on the Georgian side of the border called the Kists. And he tries to make inroads toward them to unite all of the Muslim highlanders of the Caucasus, both north and south, against the Russian Empire. On the other side of this, Georgia, throughout this period, is a kind of helpmate of the Russian Empire in its conquest of the Caucasus. That is to say, we talk about the Russian conquest of the Caucasus in the middle of the 19th century, but we should probably really talk about the Russo-Georgian conquest of the Caucasus, because so many of the noble officers who are fighting on the Russian side come from noble Georgian families who have been Russified over the previous 2 generations. Tiflis, as it was called, modern Tbilisi, is the real jewel in the crown of the Russian Empire in the South Caucasus. I'll show you a photo. There's something called the Georgian Military Highway. There it is. Photo from the beginning of the 20th century. The Georgian Military Highway that is the main overland route between Russia and Georgia in the south. And it's, trying to control and insulate this highway from raids coming from Shamil and others that takes up a lot of Russia's attention in that period. But I wouldn't say there's a kind of causal relationship between what's going on in Georgia and Shamil, simply because the chronology doesn't quite fit. Yep. You can still travel this road today. It's not passable throughout the entire year, but it is still the main overland route between central Georgia and Russia. It gives you a sense of the really dramatic geography of this part of the world. Yeah.
You said that South Ossetia is basically recognized by Russia as independent.
Yes.
Does the international community recognize South Ossetia as part of Russia?
No. So, as part of Russia?
Yes, or do they
Okay.
recognize it as part of Georgia?
Well, things get complicated. Because both Abkhazia and South Ossetia have been recognized as independent by the Russian Federation. They have been semi-recognized as independent by Nicaragua, Venezuela, and the small Pacific island nation of Nauru. Very important. And I say provisionally recognized because the presidents of those entities have said, we're going to recognize you, but the parliaments have not put through the acts of recognition yet. So technically, I guess you could say Russia and then maybe Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Nauru. And of course, Abkhazia is recognized South Ossetia, and South Ossetia is recognized Abkhazia, but if they're not recognized by anybody, do you count that they're recognized by each other as recognized? It gets sort of complicated. No one recognizes them as a part of Russia because not even Russia wants them to be a part of Russia, right? I think, I want to try to give the best spin on the Russian perspective on this possible. The Russian perspective is that the Georgians in the early 1990s engaged in a genocidal war against the Abkhaz and South Ossetians, trying to wipe them out, which to my mind is not far from the truth, actually. And that after the early 1990s, there was what amounted to a kind of Russian protectorate over these areas, pursuant to a Security Council resolution from the UN in the case of Abkhazia, pursuant to a resolution of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in the case of South Ossetia. So major international organizations blessing the Russian presence in those 2 units of Georgia. And then in 2008, Georgia tried, in contravention of international law, to use force to take those entities back. Russia intervened on behalf of those embattled minorities to prevent a genocide, and then these places declared independence on their own, and Russia happened to recognize it. Now, if that story sounds familiar to you, it should. Does it sound at all familiar? Hawaii? Actually, yeah, I hadn't even thought about that example, but that's not a bad one. Something more recent. Kosovo. That's exactly the story that the United States tells, of course, about Kosovo. And it is no accident that Kosovo declared independence in February of 2008. In August of 2008, there was the war in in South Ossetia. So from the Russian perspective, look, the United States did this in Kosovo, and Russia has now done it in exactly the same kind of way for humanitarian reasons in Georgia. And the Georgian perspective is, of course, that these territories are under military occupation of the Russian, by the Russian Federation. They will talk about the occupied territories of Georgia, meaning Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
But those are within like the political borders.
They are within the recognized, they are within the internationally recognized, unless you're, Nauru or Venezuela, within the internationally recognized borders of Georgia. Yeah.
There are currently Russian soldiers there.
Correct.
All right, well, thank you so much. My head is spinning. The subtitle could have been, it gets a little complicated.
Yeah, that's right.
But gave me so much food for thought, and I want to thank you so much for coming.